So we're going to take a look at this Vagrant file that we have provisioned for managing a Puppet development environment, and it's pretty straightforward in essence, in one aspect or another. Just go ahead here and just remove these here, since we only have one node at present. And what we're going to do, we're going to create a method or function at some point in time that actually generates this hash. And that hash will just basically have an incremental account in regards to host and some things to make the name actually static in one sense or another, which I think is a key and important thing in essence. So that would be just basically like something like you know, and then some hash, etc., or some variable, value or variable, whatever the case may be. So that would be the scenario there. However, the configuration itself is pretty straightforward. There's some issue in regards to how the Puppet server actually manages, and I'm trying to focus on actually getting to the key points in relation to what I would like to demonstrate in this particular videos themselves. So we have a temp file here, which will basically mount our development environment, our Puppet development environment into this location on our virtual machine. Don't actually need this line there, no, this one here. This will be the name of our Packer VM once it's been fully configured and available. We specify here the configuration parameters that are important or necessary in this particular scenario of things. And then what we do is, again, we define the VM, and then here what we do is we loop through each of the boxes, through each of whatever values have been configured here, and then what we do there is we just take those values and access the hash here to define the various things that need to be configured. Here we make sure that we install Puppet 5 because we're working on Puppet 5 for portability and backwards compatibility, etc., with some of the stuff that we're currently doing. And this Ansible config is not necessary, and basically what happens here is we just specify or configure the various paths for the Puppet provisioner that's available within Vagrant to automatically do the general configuration. And here we just specify the environment. Basically what this does is it takes our current Puppet environment and then it copies it into this location here using whatever mechanism has been defined for the transfer process. And then what occurs post this point is that when the provisioner runs, it will run from that development environment. This was necessary because previously when we would dynamically configure this, it was not possible to, in essence, do that because it would only copy it over once, and so the additions that we made on the system didn't transfer over to the virtual machine, which was a bit of a concern. However, that's how things are basically provisioned or configured at the moment, that we can have changes propagate onto the VM and be able to rerun things as and when needed. That's basically the provisioning for the VM in essence. And here, this provisioner here runs on all defined systems, though it's only one system defined. And then what happens is that this one here only runs on the master, which enables us to do dynamic and multi-host based configurations, which are important. And this one here basically specifies and configures the IP address, and this one here specifies the host name, pretty much, which is the general configuration for this initial environment or Puppet development environment. Actually, while that's provisioning, can take the opportunity to actually review the varying concepts regarding this. So here's our Puppet environment. Here's a development environment, and what we're mostly interested in is the FreeIPA, the IPA configuration module. As you can see, the name specified there. And what we've done to this file is we haven't done many changes, but the key thing I think to understand is that first and foremost, I think, as I explained previously, the site file is where we've configured this. We set it for no default. Service firewall D, we stopped firewall D for the moment, since we're in development and things of that nature. And these are the configuration that we have for this particular class, or for this particular module here, right? And then in that particular module, we preset all the things that we need configured for our general environment. Some of these can be taken from Factor, and Factor is basically what enables us to get information about the host that we are running or managing at a particular moment or present, or at a particular instance of time. So this is Factor here, and as you can see here, you can create custom files that will check varying configurations on the particular system to identify what type of system it is, and how the system should be utilized in essence. So here we have, it checks the certificate store configuration to determine whether to dynamically configure the role for the particular system itself, though that's not required because we actually provision that here. However, I believe that option is optional. So without getting too sidetracked here, Puppet has something called a type and a provider. So basically, service is a type. Service is a provider of a particular type. I'm not sure what type it is, and that basically enables you to be able to provide varying informations that can be utilized to ensure that you provision or configure the system appropriately. So in our instance of things, we had to create two things. We had to create two types and providers for them. The type is what we use to define the parameters that can be provided, and the provider is actually what will in turn utilize those parameters to perform particular actions on the system, or to perform particular configurations or intended Puppet behavior. So here we have our providers. We've added in a client.rb file which has our code to call the API, and that's being added in the provider section. So we'll need to require that in a bunch of these modules here. So I think the first key one I think of importance is the auth type. And if we look at the Puppet site file, we don't really use that here, but if we go into the manifest and we go into the init.puppet, we can see here that we have varying configurations. And as I said, the initial focus would be on IPA auth. Right, so with IPA auth type, and IPA auth provider. Right, so what we're going to do with that is we're going to use that to make sure that we authenticate to the API. We have a username, we have a password which is taken from whatever is applied into the class. Here, Puppet admin password, init Puppet admin password, and the IPA host, and the IPA host here is IPA server FQDN, IPA server FQDN, which is pretty straightforward in essence from my perspective of things. And then from that point onwards, okay, so that is our base configuration in essence. So IPA auth, so we can then look at the type, which is what we define first, IPA auth. And here you can use a resource API gem. However, for backwards compatibility, we just kept it simple. Well, this is meant to be more of an issue, but I believe that it's somewhat simpler in one sense or another, so that we can support Puppet 5, because then you have to install the gem. If you're using Puppet 6, you don't have to actually install the gem. So for backwards compatibility, we went with the general resource type provisioning and provider. So as you can see here, Puppet's finished. Pretty much everything's finished. Everything's been configured and the machine has been brought up, and now it's running and doing varying tasks to actually provision the system as intended. However, back to the Puppet type. In essence, so what we have here is that we have new type, IPA auth, and then we have the resource type, new parameter, UID, name, we have a username, and we have a password, CA certificate parameter, and IPA host. And I think that's all important, and it's key for varying reasons. So with these parameters here, the name is what's taken from the init variable. So here would be admin login. Here we have username. You can do a number of different things, such as setting default values and checking to ensure that the actual configuration itself can be validated against specific requirements that may be necessary for this particular instance of things. Though here we just take a simple example and just take in stock parameters that we can then supply to the configuration, or that we can then supply to the provider to then utilize. So this is the provisioner file. Now, this is the type for the IPA auth. So here what we do is we start off by importing client RB. This is the file that we utilize the IPA auth provider. And what we do is we input our client.rb file, which provides the various methods that will be utilized by the IPA configuration system. And then what we do is we specify, basically we specify the type, and then the type has a particular provider. So we specify IPA auth type, and then it has and then here we specify the name of the provider. And basically what that does is it enables, we can specify in here providers that we can utilize varying different providers within the IPA auth system, and specify different parameters, etc., or utilize the same parameters but within a different provider name. And basically we can then, having the provider has specific characteristics, and these are the characteristics that are defined here. So we have create, destroy, exists, and these are key things that basically what happens first is we check to see if there is a file called temp auth data. And I know that storing authentication information on the file system, especially in the temp file system, is not a good idea. However, the intent or the understanding at present moment in time is that whatever user that the Puppet server or system is running as is the actual user that will be utilized in actually saving and writing the file to disk. So that should be okay in essence. And basically what's happening is that it will check to see if the file exists, and if the file does exist, then it will return true or false. It will return true, and if it doesn't, it will return false. Now if the file does not exist, it will run the create method, and this is also run depending on whether you set present or absent within the particular configuration itself. So then that will run the that will run the create process. The create process just sets the necessary configuration and calls the HTTP auth parameter that takes in those variables. To remove this here, and then with those particular variables we can then now run an IPA auth utilise method, which if we look at the client RB, that just basically exports a login method that we can then utilize to perform a login and return a cookie or a set of headers, etc. And then when that's returned into session data, the session data is then written to the temp auth data file. Better way of managing this, still sort of looking into that to try to better understand what can be a better way of securing this session data here. And then that's pretty much it. And then basically what happens is that, you know, it'll always work in that loop. If this has been set to absent, then it will delete the file to remove the cookie data from the system, in essence. And then now this is basically running. It should finish provisioning in a minute. Everything goes well, hopefully. Cool, so that was everything from these basically allows that if you change, it'll rerun create. If you change any of the parameters, it'll basically rerun create. And also with exist, there's a bunch of things that you can do to check and see those corresponding parameters, and if those parameters themselves actually match. Okay, so cool. So there's a bunch of things that's actually happened. We'll go over the output later. And that's pretty much it for the general create section of the IPA auth, and that's basically what's occurred here, is that it's logged in, it's created authentication information and stored it to this particular file location, and you can manage that as and when required based on varying factors of things, but it can be extended to do more.